Welcome late in the semester of the fall year of 2023. This is your professor, Dr. Aaron Sheedy. I'm with professor at USC and Calarts foremostly, and also we're doing a Harvard-specific film class that everyone at Harvard can take with Coursera and gain credit for. Hard to believe that you can gain credit for learning about movies, but not as easy as we think it's going to be because of some of the topics that they're still getting down to solving, like the problem of what films to save and when, depending on what film's going to die first, even though that might mean another film that we need to restore first for some apparent criteria that's hard to work out before one film dies or the other, and which one to let live. Is kind of like you feel like a film executioner because you can only save one at a time, and while one's decaying, you're saving the other one from not. And then you just get a team and they're all doing it at once, and you get like several people in the lab. You can have these labs with up to 6 people restoring these films, and that's about all the size of the room can contain for these research scientists, or they would have 100 people at once restoring them. That the science is peculiar to only a few archives is clearly fine, but that there would be a good response if other archives were to open, but that the Library of Congress is fail-safe in its archive and does hire about 100 people for restoration purposes of all kinds of media. UCLA Film and Archive, of which I've worked with both extensively, I would say the UCLA archive does in fact have the same process, but they have maybe a sizable, smaller staff than the Library of Congress, because the Library of Congress doesn't just deal in film. Now, that's not even as complicated as like a theory question would be, which is, what is the language of film? Is it the syntax that we see while watching the image, or is it the syntax that's created by what's in the image, or how the image is moving, or what comes at the next image, which is a cut? And then you're talking about syntax of films, but I thought syntax were words. Well, a cut is a word, and sometimes, in a movie, when the director wants you to notice the cut, and most of the rest of the time, they don't want you to notice it, or it doesn't really matter if you do or not, the story moves forward anyway. With a good editing pattern, you're always saying, well, this is the way I like to edit it, so that's a good editing pattern. But then there might be a preferred way that you could learn from even one of these films that was restored, where they edited a film like in Greed, and it just goes on, and then you extrapolate how they edited it, and then it becomes to life in today's vision of a totally done over version of Greed, and now you've got this total come on to a nostalgia of shot that's really good editing, even though you took it from Greed, but you changed a few things about it that made it your own personal image in the film. But now we're talking about Hitchcock Truffaut, and I can't tell you how important this book is to cinema, and we're going to go through some of it. We don't have enough time to go through the entire book. I know we would love to. I've seen a guy, my friend Carl, he tore through this book, and you can just get lost in the movies, and as far as Hitchcock goes, if you go to the last page of Hitchcock Truffaut and go to the filmography page, then you see this picture of Alfred Hitchcock with his 61 films. Now, I'm not really getting this in focus there, but you see that Hitchcock is standing at a huge stack of films, and he's made 61 films, and for those to be Hollywood and big budgeted and orchestrated, and some British films that were breakthrough at the time in his early stage, you're getting American Hollywood, you're getting early British detective, you're getting everything slammed in, film noir in between, and all the 40s film noir like Shadow of a Doubt is one of the most intense suspense thrillers of all. And Hitchcock really staged Shadow of a Doubt really interesting because, and it's one of the Village Voice top movies. I mean, it's a great movie, and it's been remade. It's been remade dozens of times. Fargo was one of its remakes. Shadow of a Doubt. A Simple Plan. Those movies take that whole plot where you suddenly come into money because of a rich relative, and he's not interested in sharing it because it's bank robbery money, but you think he's innocent. You get pulled into the thing with him. You think he's an innocent being somehow stalked by this government that wants to stop him, and he's not really doing anything. But it's the Hitchcock suspense that you kind of get the picture throughout the movie that maybe he's doing something wrong. And by judging him as wrong, we're already seeing Hitchcock putting on these wrong images of things we don't always see in a movie like this. And you can see Blue Velvet takes this whole plot. You take the house from Blue Velvet and you look deep into a leaf in the backyard and there's an ear sitting there. And you're like, why does this ear have ants on it? And there's things even more unquestionable as to why Hitchcock would include it, but that he is coming to get you with his scare fest is one thing he does best with his suspense thrillers. See, I think all of his suspense thrillers are actually terrifying. Now that the horror film genre is mostly terrifying, that doesn't mean the suspense thriller can't be terrifying, and that he's outre and out there as to even use a Salvador Dali clip in Spellbound where he had him illuminate a dream sequence, and it does it in kind of a Hitchcock meets Dali way that's so hesitant of parodying itself that it's like its own remake while it's making itself in a little student film in the middle of a Hitchcock movie, and that's terrifying. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen that since Buñuel and Dali teamed up for Un Chien Andalou, and that's another genre of the avant-garde. I mean, The Mirror Has Three Faces, or Mille et Mon Tentant, is not the most subtly easy films to take in. Sometimes those films get a little absurd, and that Hitchcock loves avant-garde films doesn't even come completely clean in the dream sequence in Vertigo, which is so important that we're going to talk about it in a minute. But Shadow of a Doubt, let me finish. It uses all the rules of Hitchcock, which we know are like the little to represent the small in terms of image, like the synecdoche, like the key in Notorious that goes from the wine bottle to the top of the stairs in reverse. And, we know that's where the wine bottle is. We have to break to get the key. And the key has been placed in there. And we see in this large tracking shot that becomes a reverse synecdoche, which is ironic because they filmed it in reverse. And Hitchcock's so full of film tricks that I can't even unleash how he does one scene where Joseph Cotton is on the ground. He's the uncle that's maybe or maybe not, but probably is doing something wrong, and ends up on the top of a building and then walks away like Superman. And he's, again, the government's stumped, and we think the family wants him to get off the hook because the government's like stumped. But that Joseph Cotton walks away from the crime like nothing has happened totally sits in our mind like, how could we have just seen him on the ground in it? But he's Joseph Cotton. He can do that. He's in the movie Citizen Kane or whatever. He can do weird things like fly and jump off cliffs and stuff and be fine. And, and Hitchcock's always playing these actors against type. And even then he's kind of playing Joseph Cotton against type. And against type just means they have a kind of typography as their narrative for their character persona, that these classes of actors in rank have their own genre almost set unto themselves as movie star brand naming comes in their name and how much it's worth and how big it is, and they put these big names in these Hitchcock movies. And even when he was doing like The Lodger in the 20s in the silent era, he was already using like Ivor Novello, which is a pretty expensive actor, and he's making his way through the ranks faster than like any other director ever has. I mean, John Ford had to turn out B westerns for a long time, but Hitchcock was in it to win it from the beginning because he was at the beginning already making pretty much grade A movies. That The Pleasure Gardens kind of B ranked because they deal with ghosts means that Hitchcock's only going to deal with ghosts in a really morose way in Rebecca by giving them a point of view shot as though we, the audience, are suddenly in the ghost and looking at Rebecca. And looking at Rebecca means that she's invisible because she's the ghost. And that movie was the first Hitchcock American film, and he just moved to America that year. And how hard would it be to move to America and still be a top director? I don't know. He just moved right into Hollywood, was accepted, do whatever he want. It's said in critical studies that he was given more freedom than any other director that was ever worked, and that he had final cut for the most part. Depends on how you look at censorship, and some of these interviews with Truffaut kind of mandate that censorship has been hard on Alfred Hitchcock over the years, that the movies would have been more gruesome and maybe meme-like we see in a David Fincher movie today, is no, without a doubt true. That Hitchcock was going to push the envelope farther and pushed it about as far as he can go is amazing. That actually censorship did probably ruin a couple of his movies isn't necessarily true, because his movies are great, but that the censorship could have potentially ruined it means that in this case, the censorship board, whatever you say, is wrong. And Truffaut and Hitchcock spend the length of this film discussing how it would have been made if Hitchcock had it exactly his way, which he did have it exactly his way to about 95%, which was more than any other director in the studio system. The only directors that got control like that was Orson Welles on his first film, and F.W. Murnau on Sunrise. And then Hitchcock was given all this control, but didn't really have to guard his editing canisters, because they'd come in and censor you from script up. The censorships were pretty brutal in that day, but the Hitchcock's images were brutal and hard to take. Doesn't match that he was already a superstar as a director, so it shouldn't have mattered, because technically he started in these movies with Ivor Novello, and earlier than that with The Pleasure Garden, and already he's making movies about the same subject later on. The Lodger, for instance, is his suspense thriller genre. That the typography of the suspense thriller is related with Men in Black and kind of this dark haircut, and these rainy nights, and kind of this guy walks through with a cigarette, and the Hitchcock has these burning images, but also takes them domestic in Shadow of a Doubt. It's by far one of the scariest moves to the domestic space of Hitchcock, and what he didn't censor out scares me, and that's why I like about this book, because it talks about all the things that Hitchcock would have changed, which is nothing, which is everything, because there was the one problem he'd always had, which doesn't really mean he didn't find amazing ways around it and still make a great film within those considerations. That he's the great auteur, you have to give him credit, because, see, Truffaut wrote the auteur theory. And that means Hitchcock probably is the great auteur, because Truffaut wrote the theory. The theory goes, and Andrew Sarris reiterated it, the auteur theory is that the tradition of quality, like André Bazin talks about, the French New Wave leader that started with Truffaut, and Bazin was telling Truffaut that he liked the metteur en scène, or the craftsman. Now, the metteur en scène relates to the mise en scène and is the builder of the mise en scène. That's metteur en scène. And mise en scène is everything in the frame and the outside of the picture within the movie. And that's usually production design, and then comes costume and makeup when you have characters and whatnot. But that Truffaut spoke well of the metteur en scène, but said there's this new thing that he's noticing with American films, especially with Hitchcock, and that is the auteur theory, that the director is the writer of the film, that he takes his own pen, stylus, camera, and just writes this movie with the camera. And Truffaut was doing that with film, with Jules and Jim in the French New Wave. He was writing pictures with his camera. And so you see that Hitchcock was already the auteur that Truffaut was talking about when he invented the auteur theory. So if you even believe in auteurs, that does qualify you as being a true, maybe the number one auteur, as being in that. That's how we take our critical study seriously. If Truffaut said it, it's almost gospel, especially if it's in that letters book that Matt Klickstein gave me, and you can read about Truffaut's letters, and they're amazing. His correspondences are so detailed that Hitchcock couldn't have had a better person to interview him. And the scary pictures in this book. Here's some more. I think this is of the wrong man. And you can tell that all of his movies have a stylized design and a stylized shot when he's a component of the film or not. You see these very, very good actors in a very compromising way going out of the house in the birds, and there's even birds lingering down there, and they have sharp beaks, and these birds in the movie The Birds, it's apocalyptic what you see in there. It's the end of the world, and here's Hitchcock testing out the bird screecher, And it's this computer that they built just to make the birds. You got to remember, the birds was 1963. I know it has some nostalgic throwback material in it at the beginning, but it gets really viscerally modern towards the end. Now you take this scene up here. I was going to talk about this one. This one's Rope. And Rope is one I've got to discuss in full in a minute. But first, I want to cover something that I really needed to cover, and that's Vertigo. See, Vertigo is an important one because it took me about 5 times before I knew what the plot was. Had to have my friends explain it to me 3 times, and I still didn't understand the plot of Vertigo. And here's why. Because it's the hardest plot for me personally to understand. That I can assimilate the plot in Battleship Potemkin is profoundly one of my hardest things to do, but I can do it. If I needed to take a shot-by-shot bric-a-brac of anything, that would be the case. But Vertigo, I've definitely spanned out almost shot for shot what's going on and still realized that it's all juggled in the editing, not just to diss on censorship, which Hitchcock made it clear to do even in his TV show, was to diss censorship. I mean, that became his new rule, you know. But that Vertigo is about a woman, and I'm going to spoiler this a little bit, but it's about a woman who pretends to be a ghost of a dead woman, and to come on to a guy to get him to think that he kills her, and then she dies on accident, and it was kind of his fault, but he only fell for her because he could make her look like the ghost of the woman that died the same way. So if you're following me so far, that's how easy that plot is to follow. And I can see why my film school friends were chastising me. I have to explain it over and over. So that's the last time I'm explaining it. Although the one thing I would notice in it is it's a hard movie for me to grasp, although the animation is beautiful. And I don't have quite a hold on what the symbolic meaning of the female-male gaze and how the object-subject positioning determines the point of view. But here's what I think. The object-subject point of view is so overbearing from Jimmy Stewart that it's like he's still holding that skeleton telescope from Rear Window, and it's like he's looking right at Kim Novak in Vertigo with the eyes of like he's got a microscope on her, and every little move she makes has to represent this lady. It's like he's been hypnotized too. It's like his dream was hypnotic, and he was hypnotized way before that, and it was the only thing that could break him out of his dream, and now he's got vertigo because he doesn't know if he's asleep or awake. And this is what's terrifying about the film. He actually has somewhat shown insomnia, although we're never led to believe it's insomnia. And this isn't a censorship glitch. This is Hitchcock having fun with our nerves, saying what's really wrong with him. We can't figure it out, but we know something is. But then if he's the one that's put on this whole thing so he can see this woman fall out of a lobby twice on accident the second time because he's taking her up there to reenact it, I failed to mention, then how could this woman be completely obliged to do whatever she says unless she's his prisoner anyway, and she wants to be? Because in one scene, she jumps in the water so he saves her, and then she's like got to dry up, and he's got to take care of her clothes and get her redressed and into bed and everything, and she knows that, and she's totally playing him, but that he lets her because he's got control of the situation, supposedly, is the world's biggest jinx. And then Hitchcock loves jinxes. He jinxes them so hard that they end up following the exact same pattern, which is not so bad a jinx, considering that's the whole meaning of jinx. He makes them follow the exact same pattern that they went through at the beginning to the end and make sure that they correlated in almost every single way exact. Only it was shown from different points of view and different temporalities within the event so that it gets confusing on purpose. And that's not a bad use of confusing on purpose or even an avant-garde using. That's a technique, and it's not convolutions. It's more of a roundabout, like you get one cycle that's important chasing the other cycle that's just as important, chasing the most important cycle, and they'll all eventually come to a head in these like apocalyptic endings. And that the birds is the apocalypse is questionable because I have a feeling it could be, but that Vertigo is one of the hardest movies for me to figure out. We will go on to Rope. And in Rope, By the way, Vertigo is usually everybody's pick for best Hitchcock, so I'm not going to deny that everybody's pick for best Hitchcock is actually Vertigo, and that's probably why, because no one knows quite what's going on in it, but loves it anyway, or that could be me only, or me, everyone understands completely what it's like to be into a movie about a woman that stares at a painting that she dresses up like, because whatever you do, if you're going to make a movie, have a woman dress up like the painting and then say that's the object of the movie. That is the heart and center of it because she looks at it and we see the painting within the painting. What is the movie to become? A story within a story that's the same story but makes a better story by being the story within the story. And that's a little confusing. And Rope's even interesting to explain because in Rope we have a beginning to end. It's all looped together to be done in one shooting. Now, in one shooting, that means there's actually only one take of the movie, even if you count the fact that 20 minutes in they had a reel change. Now, 20 minutes in on a reel change means that's normal, but you've got to somehow say cut and stop the action temporarily till you can reload the camera or another camera standing by so it's faster to load. Because loading a film camera is a little cumbersome and it takes some time, but that if you get used to it, you can get it slam banged in there almost by the time it's time to switch shots on Hitchcock's Rope, because they have some where the character's walking by and he walks by to the next camera that's ready to roll. That they were loading film in the first camera was only to avail that they had backup cameras, and Hitchcock actually did say that he had it wound so that it would pass from camera to camera that were already loaded, and fortunately they kept some loaded because they undermined the principle of you can never count how much film you're actually using to compare how much film you're actually using, especially in one take, because you got the zero place, you got the decimals, you got things you got to take into consideration, you got the inch marker on the film. These things have to be traced. So Hitchcock had it set up that if they played Rope like a play, like a theater stage play, like a theatrical realism, which really this movie started theatrical realism in a big way, but there was a little bit of it going on with Orson Welles and the John Houseman Project is true, but that Hitchcock played the whole thing like a play and filmed it all in technically one take, because even though he's tag teaming the cameras they're using that are placed in various areas to be picked up and moved when the next one runs out of film, and they did use some of the ones that were wound, they happen to be better cameras. They had it set up that way. They're not playing any tricks. They're getting this all done in the time it takes to act it out, to film it, and then to show it is all the same duration. The showing of the film is as long as it took them to film it. The filming of the film is as long as the film is on. And the film is as long as the shot was, which is as long as the film. So we know that about Rope, and we also know that we have these characters who are seemingly like the characters from Strangers on a Train, only somehow this is the sequel. Because we had these two guys that are like kind of homoerotic, but in a dangerous way. Like they want to do bad things to their professor, and he doesn't get that, and he doesn't know there's a dead body in the storage in the trunk. There's a dead body in the trunk in the room, and nobody knows it's there that's watching the movie really, except they place it in for the suspense value right at first, and then they move on to everybody entering the house not knowing there's a freaking corpse in the ground. And of course the audience is now terrified because there's a corpse on the set in the chest, and everybody's fooling them, and they're like these serial killer guys, again like the Strangers on a Train, like serial killer guy, like Robert Walker, because in Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train, he comes after that guy in this weird kind of homoerotic way, and these aren't homophobic metaphors. These are like guys with repressed homophobia that lash out on people. That Hitchcock used a villain like that is totally opposed to censorship, not because you don't believe that, because that's totally out there. To think that there were like these Fincher plots going on in these Hitchcock movies that were more morose the more you analyze them. And Truffaut analyzes every moment And I'm telling you, they're safe for gay audiences. But man, is that gay homophobe, you know, essential to the villain in a Hitchcock that is the only thing about his characters that's not ambiguous, because technically in Hitchcock we're led to believe that his characters are solid homemaking breadwinning villains and total lunts, cowards, dunces, heroes. And that way we're all thinking the hero's gonna lose, but the hero musters it up for one of his mythology of Hollywood things and beats these guys, but really that these villains are even in place and have done all these bad things already. It's totally surrounding us, even in North by Northwest. Not that he's not going to escape from the villain, because you know it's Cary Grant, and you know he's going to beat that plane that comes and buzzes him. You know he's going to duck under it. He'll be fine. But what you don't know is that he gets a little nicked by it and is starting to lose power and was really coming close to die, but not in real life, in the movie, of course. And if Cary Grant is having trouble with these guys, it's not so much that they're the under siege henchmen, it's that they have already done some terrible things and are ready to admit to it in front of him, which means someone's going to get in trouble and have to probably die. Now, that there's always someone dying in a Hitchcock film is true, that there's always a death. I'm pretty sure in every Hitchcock film there's a death. Trouble with Harry's about a corpse. Rope's about a corpse. I don't think that the Pleasure Garden is without a death. If there's not a death in all the silent films, I'll vouch. There probably is, but it may not be a melancholy, tragic death. It may just be like, and grandma the next day woke up with the colic and died, which is tragic and esoteric and existential. But in a silent film that way, you kind of forget that one of these characters that was earlier in the movie is now passed on, because you're like, well, I thought she already died or was going to die, and then she died later. Okay, we got that subtitle. Now I got about 5 other subtitles to keep track of, you know. It's not that it's hard to watch a silent film. It's just that when you're keeping track of all the characters, you sometimes forget whether or not someone died. But in the sound film, it's so morose in every way that Hitchcock does it. But we love to watch this kind of thing because of the aesthetic beauty of how he makes the shot into what we want to see, regardless of if it's what we don't really need to see or want to see. It's what we want to see. If we're into like crime novels, we want to see this kind of level of captivating machinery. And if we're into film noir movies, we want to see this psychological depth of character. And that there's everything on the table with Hitchcock. Everything's out there for what you need. And one of the great things about calling him an auteur is that you can lure in his auteur style when you're directing movies. And in fact, I've actually heard a rumor that if you watch all of Hitchcock's films, all of them, which I've seen all of them, and if you see all of them from The Pleasure Garden to Final Plot, Family Plot, then you have to become a filmmaker, at least for one film. And for one film, it wouldn't hurt to try and be Hitchcock, because Hitchcock is the answer to what you want to do when you're an auteur. You're like, where's an old number 13? We can pull a number 13 on this movie and get this Cabin in the Woods thing made, you know? It's like we can do that. Then here's a good one I'll show you. This is Lifeboat. Lifeboat's kind of like Rope, because it's in one space and at one time at the same time. It's like, and then there's Hitchcock is in this Lifeboat movie, but you see, he would make these cameos, and everybody loves this. This is the easy part. The Hitchcock's only in about 35 of his films. I don't know that he says he's in all of them. He probably is, and I don't debate Hitch that he doesn't say he's in all of them. I probably don't debate Hitch on that one either, but he's got this poster here that he's dieting, and suddenly his diet worked. He went out with the cast and crew into an isolated location where they could film a water vesicle that had escaped from this ship, and in like this narrative mythology way, they've got to pick someone to throw him overboard because he's going to kill them if they don't. So they have to kill him. And again, there's a dead person in a movie that you wouldn't expect anyone to die, because they didn't have to throw someone overboard so the raft wouldn't sink, literally. But if the guy had blown the place to bits, it would have sank anyway, so they had to kill him. This coming so quick and sharp, and nobody's holding it against them. They just want to be rescued. They don't even know what's going on with the guy that kills the German that's on the raft, and whether or not he was a war refugee. He probably was. and that they're doing it patriotic isn't so hesitantly, but that they're on a raft and they want their lives to be saved is what's so epic about the movie, because they, there's a happy ending coming, but the movie itself is about how sad it is to be lost at all at sea, in a way that like a later movie Castaway would be, where you've given up beyond desperation. There's nothing you could do. Prayer doesn't work necessarily, although it cheers you up a little bit to see someone praying, but on Lifeboat, you just get this cast at sea kind of meaninglessness feeling, like you're lost out there too with them, and you want them to get rescued as bad, but in a way you feel like because you're isolated in this space the whole movie, that you'll never be set free even if you get off. And that's what Hitchcock loves it, because Hitchcock is saying you'll never be set free of this idea of a lifeboat. If you have to throw someone overboard, will that really be the context of you calling for help? I don't necessarily think so. So, while we have time, I did want to say some of the questions that I'll ask about the Hitchcock movies later will be seen on the final, but they won't be as complicated as some of the film syntax we'll get into here in a minute. What I want to say is there's some films to comment on, but since I'm getting into film context, the 39 Steps is a very important film to talk about with Hitchcock, because it's where he generated this style, not just the picarolle narrative, which is a mythology that defines the rite of passage a man on an adventure out to get the thing he needs and desires and bring it back to his home base or whatever. It's that very notion of the picarolle that goes on series of objective quests to conquer his fears of those objectives that he no longer has fear for after conquering them. And Hitchcock did 39 Steps in the way that you have this myth of total cinema that Bazin is already talking about. Only I don't know if he brought up, Bazin did question 39 Steps and wondered if it was as plausible as Hitchcock had made it, but that Hitchcock always went for plausibility is one of the things that's absolutely freakish about Hitchcock, is because he always wanted to make sure the things in the movie could actually happen in real life. Like he did like fantasy and these visions of animation and Vertigo and these spellbound, dolly cuts are all great, but Hitchcock wants you to watch the image in reality, and he wants you to see things that could actually happen, even if he's using one of his special effects that he was always good at. Now, the strength syntagmatique is where we talk about episodic editing, which is where you put categories of editing around scenography, and scenography is like the mise-en-scène that travels from one side of the film to the next. And whatever is on the visible screen is where you are in the timeline, and that's the scenography, is what you're seeing in the shot, which is the mise-en-scène. Greatly, the movement is the mise-en-scène shot, and the movement here is just to make us define what we are, and that's scenography. And that you can replace that with typography isn't necessarily true, but when you can go for episodic, you're setting up scenes by scene so that they flow together, but that they can be juxtaposed. One set of syntams and another comes from the parallel syntam, which is a back and forth A to B shot. So you take the present shot and the next shot, and go back to the present shot and the next shot, although they may have been forward moved in time, which is still part of the parallel syntam. The bracket syntam is harder to understand because it takes a miniature episodic syntam and combines the autonomous shot, for instance, with the pair of shots that are just scenes that are put together through classic impulse of episodic, or a bracket, or like brackets would be more like a thematic editing where the picture is cut to the sound, where you would do like a thematic edit. Now that the episodic syntam, that's all we're going to cover for now, is the episodic syntam can have a parallel and then a bracket and then go back to a bracket and have a parallel in whatever redeeming order. But there's other syntams too we'll have to save for later. Maybe next year or something we'll go more into the syntagmatique, but that you need to know it growing up in film theory and criticism, because it will help you balance what you're watching as a shot and how you can categorize it as what we refer to as film language. Now, that the 39 step has the same thing I've been ratifying with the classical Hollywood style, even though it's a terrifying suspense thriller and there's death around every corner and there's a few deaths in the movie. But that in 39 steps, you also have the totality of the image masking where all the different jumps and bumps are, that it's told like a classical film, is because it's Hitchcock saying, I want to make a Hollywood Britain like co-fling, where we do everything kind of like Hollywood editing, like I've been seeing in class, but we make it even snazzier and pick it up. And then Hitchcock really mastered this whole seamless editing thing, this suture tutor where everything is stapled in and covered up, and then you don't really know what is being pressed on, and being pressed on is being fabricated so many times that it comes together into one piece that's seamless. I mean, you don't question a jump cut in most Hollywood movies, even where the seamlessness is kind of falling apart just because of, some kind of redundancy like a Roy Rogers. You still get a well played out, relaxing view of the world in a way your eyes like to simulate it, what you want to see. And I think 39 Steps has a more profound influence on a lot of the films that came after. I think 39 Steps went above and beyond to say we're still making movies with the impression that that they're that you see through them, that they're clear, that they're tangible, that you can see all the way through a movie, isn't just because the editing is spliced that way, but it's because of Hitchcock taking that film and influencing the rest of the world. Because, as far as I'm concerned, just like some of the other ones we've named, Vertigo and North by Northwest and Psycho and Shadow of a Doubt and Notorious being the best, these other movies are right there too. I mean, they say that from Strangers on a Train to Family Plot, you'll have to see the movies in between there. Marnie, The Iron Curtain, are pretty much all masterpieces. The Birds, you don't have many argue that Hitchcock may actually have the most masterpieces. I know I said it was Griffith who had the most masterpieces, but Hitchcock actually might have more and better ones that are. See, if you're judging them for how good they are, you could even say that like Wells had a few films on that level, but that Wells' films got more invaded by censorship and destroyed than Hitchcock's was because Hitchcock had cut a deal that was going back to the 39 Steps, saying, I'll make Total Hollywood like movies like that one, and then he totally blows it away with bringing his British flair to America, and everybody wants to direct with like the British flair of Hitchcock now. So we've covered a lot, and I'm not going to burden your ears with too much more. We've got a little bit more to cover. I would say Marnie has this interesting thing with its crane technique, where Marnie, when she sees a flashback, interested in temporal changes like Rashomon, there's this time change in Hitchcock's Marnie when she has a flashback to her post-traumatic stress disorder, triggers a flashback, and it like moves the frame in and moves the frame out, and that it looks like a memory we would see in our own memory is already going back to that avant-garde, morose, like outre, let's make it weird, but let's make it real kind of thing. And that I've heard that psychology actually has cases of the things that have happened in Hitchcock movies. Kind of reminds me of like a CSI show, right? But that Hitchcock has these Sherlock Holmes gestures is not really overlooked, but there is a detective hard-boiled case at the line of some of these movies. Now that the detectives in Shadow of a Doubt, the whole family's trying to guard their uncle against, is one of the most sinister things in the whole thing, because usually the detective, like in the Fouillard movies that had influenced Hitch when he was at film clubs, getting ready to make The Lodger his first suspense thriller, which is like a roller coaster ride through a genre. That suspense thriller is a genre that defines itself by its words in the genre are totally true. That suspense thrillers were Hitchcock's mastery. I don't deny that you can't make a suspense thriller without referencing Alfred Hitchcock. Did Alfred Hitchcock can't be referenced without the word suspense thriller is true too, and largely not only because Truffaut canonized Hitchcock, but that everyone demanded that Hitchcock be canonized by Truffaut, who was one of Hitchcock's biggest fans and used the technique all the time. That Marnie's technique has only been partially used in films like by Jonathan Demme, where he's had some PTSD flashbacks that use the same almost vertigo shot pullback filter at first, is interesting. But that almost all Hitchcock movies have been redone in a way, and we talked about Psycho, and Psycho has been listed as the most written about film in history. And since I already covered it, we won't go over it too much, except to say there's this morose POV image of the camera fully tracking to the money in the bag in the bedroom of the guy that killed the woman that he's got her stuff strewn about. Now that the camera's like a POV cam, it's like a detective, or it's like this roaming Rebecca cam. Or it's that the POV of the camera is now a character because Hitchcock wants it to be, but he's done that before, and in what films we think of the scene where the kid is running with the bomb. And when the kid is running with the bomb, he's got this whole bomb in sabotage, and he's about to blow up, and then he stops for like some cream corn in a can or something. No, I'm kidding. He gets like this cotton candy. This kid gets distracted. He doesn't know he's carrying a bomb in a film container. He gets on the subway, and the whole thing blows up, and you're like, Hitchcock just blew up that little kid. And Hitchcock in Truffaut explains that censorship almost railed Hitchcock out of the movies for that, and he was not only not allowed to blow up another little kid movie, he never did blow up another little kid in a movie that I can think of, though Patricia Hitchcock did seem kind of young to get strangled by Robert Walker in Strangers on a Train, but that Patricia Hitchcock lived through that strangling, and Hitchcock's only making a movie is one of those things that he likes to mess with your heads with. And that's probably why you even get negative criticism from his actors in their later years, not because they didn't remember what he said, but because they were all pulling pranks on each other and saying to the media this ridiculous stunt publicity stuff about how, oh, he was a mean to me. You know, it's like Hitchcock wasn't mean to anybody. He ran a fresh, hard, like Cronenberg, nothing go wrong set. That it was a hard set, not humorless, but loudly redundant laughing couldn't be tolerated on a soundstage because a soundstage picks up every noise on the stage. That Hitchcock could clear a soundstage and have it silent by mass is not exactly an unknown fact, but that he could clear a set to the point that everything could be like anesthetic to what the characters are going through is totally true. But that it's a stage of theater and a stage of documentary we've got to take into account, because the documentary side and the theater side go back into the employment of his actors as method actors. That even The Wrong Man puts Henry Fonda through a method actor training is interesting, because he has to feel what it's like to be in The Trial and not Orson Welles' The Trial, which is an equally good movie. But Hitchcock's Wrong Man takes the Franz Kafka story and puts Henry Fonda in the position of being this one that has to realize what it's like to be trapped in jail for no reason, but to think there is a reason why. So in conclusion, and I'll let you go bask over these waves for a minute and catch your breath, and we'll have another masterclass very soon. And this is the third to last class, so the final's approaching. Don't worry, it's going to be pretty easy. I know some of these lectures get complex. Remember, the one complexity that Hitchcock really picked up at the cinema club was that he edited films like Battleship Potemkin or like Padovkin, where you'd see a clock and then you'd see the inner workings of the clock to make it look like time is moving and you can't stop it. When the little kid's got his film canister, you're seeing all these things that are making time either move or time either stop. And it's done in this montage kind of way that makes like this British American perspective on how you would do a Russian montage. And that German expressionism, we can't strive enough to tell you that the movies like Nosferatu blew Hitchcock's mind. When he saw Nosferatu, he thought it was one of the most amazing things he'd ever seen. That Nosferatu almost launched him off his chair is so true. And that Hitchcock was planning in these film clubs to come out with some kind of style that combined German expressionism with Russian editing is really one of his main styles. I take it on a very high source, Drew Casper from USC, who is the Hitchcock chair, an unrenowned expert on Hitchcock. And I think I'll let you be for now, because if I was Alfred Hitchcock, I wouldn't let you be. I'd talk like him for the remaining 5 minutes of the class, but I'm going to let you off early because finals week is coming in 2 weeks, and it won't be pretty if you didn't listen to my syntax.